Hey everyone! Welcome back to another episode of Coffee and Compliance. I'm your host, Ashley, and I'm so happy that you're here and tuning in for this episode, which today's episode is going to be over something that comes up in HR conversations quite a lot, and that is toxic workplaces. And specifically, red flags that people ignore until things are already on fire. And this is not meant to be, too dramatic of an episode. We will save that for a later episode when I decide to drop some tea on why I'm currently and unexpectedly unemployed. But this is not a name and shame situation. This is a let's talk about the stuff we all quietly clock, but don't always feel empowered to say out loud type of episode. But before we can jump into our episode, we have to start with talking about our coffee of the day, which in today's case, I thought some hot tea would be more appropriate because we are definitely going to be spilling all of the tea on toxic workplaces in this episode. So my tea of the day is a chai latte, just steeped in some hot water and a little bit of cream and some sugar-free chai syrup. So it's nice, it's warm, it's comforting. It gives coffee vibes because it's hot, but gives me a little break from, some extra caffeine. And yeah, I had two cups of coffee this morning, so I needed a little pick me up that was a little different. And yeah, so I'm super excited to jump into this episode with all of y'all today. So make sure you grab your coffee, your tea, your matcha, just whatever you're sipping on this morning, and let's jump into this week's episode. So let's start off with talking about what actually makes a workplace toxic. A toxic workplace is not just one or two bad managers, because pretty much every company is going to have that. It's not just one really stressful week at work, and it's also not just one awkward conversation or hard conversation that had to be had. Toxicity is about patterns. So when fear is the main motivator, when burnout is treated like a personality trait, when accountability only applies to certain people, and when employees feel like speaking up is risky. And then also a big one, which is when employees are always concerned about who is getting fired next and never actually feel secure in their jobs. So those are the type of patterns that can make up a toxic workplace. It's really important to note that toxic workplaces usually don't look toxic from the outside. They may even seem like the best choice place to work when you're interviewing and you're job searching. They're the type of jobs that look like they're high performing, they're fast paced, they hit all their goals, they volunteer in the community, and of course, they look great on LinkedIn. But if most people are constantly anxious, walking on eggshells, or just questioning their own reality at work, that is definitely not a culture fit. That is a huge system problem, a huge toxic workplace. Okay, so now that we're done talking about what truly makes a workplace toxic, let's talk about some early red flags that HR and leaders often miss. Essentially, when HR, they get that gut feeling, the one where you just can't pinpoint it to one incident, but something just feels off. Let's talk about those red flags. So, the same roles keep turning over. That's a big one. But leadership blames it on, oh, they just haven't found the right fit. Of course, sure. Let's blame it on that. The next one, high performers are suddenly disengaged or exhausted all the time, and they used to be engaged and motivated. We all know those employees. Another one, policies exist, but enforcement of them is just inconsistent, and this may be due to managers playing favorites or managers being lazy themselves. Another one is feedback only ever flows downwards, but never up. And then here's a big one, and all of our HR leaders, we need to listen out for this one. But complaints start coming in casually, but then they suddenly stop. That silence is not peace. or that issue has not been resolved. It's people have decided that nothing's going to come of it, and it's just not worth it to keep on harping on it and trying to get someone to listen to them. And as HR, when people stop coming to you, that should make you more concerned, not less. Okay, so now let's talk about some phrases that keep toxic culture alive. And I know you've heard all of these that we're about to go through, but just stay with me. Let's go through them real quick. So the first one, that's just how they are. Okay. Second one, they're intense, but they get results. Mm-hmm. Sounds fun. It's not for everyone. Some jobs aren't, but okay. Another one, we don't want to rock the boat. I do. Yes, I do. We're like family. And this one is a little so-so because I do feel like some people that I've really connected with at work are part of my like friend slash family group, but we don't treat work like it's family because work-life balance. You go there, you work, you go home to your family. And then the last one, let's table this for now. I'm like, okay, so we all know that this is going to be forgotten about and you're not going to get back to me on this. But like I said, there's so many more we could add to this list, but that's just some of the ones that are personally my favorite that help keep the toxic culture alive. When results excuse harm, the culture is already compromised. And HR often gets stuck in the middle. It's just what happens. Seeing the impact on employees while leadership focuses on the output and then you having to carry that tension. That's just exhausting. Am I right? Now let's chat about addressing workplace toxicity without blowing everything up. Because not every situation needs some dramatic overhaul. But ignoring it, not an option. That always almost makes things worse. So here are some realistic starting points for HR leaders. You can document patterns, not just incidents when they occur. Reset expectations with your managers clearly and in writing, and even have them sign off on it so that you can move forward with progressive discipline in the future if need be. And then also help normalize feedback going both directions. And lastly, create psychological safety before asking for honesty. And please stop rewarding burnout disguised as dedication. Being constantly overwhelmed is not a leadership competency. Okay, so now let's look at how we can build a healthier workplace culture proactively. And the best time to address any type of workplace toxicity is before it becomes normal. Not after people have been terminated left and right or before burnout is the cause of your turnover. Being proactive about building your healthy workplace culture means that you're building it into your onboarding experience for your new hires. You're building it into your manager trainings and setting the expectation. It means proactively addressing issues by handling them day to day and not letting issues pile up or go too long without being addressed. And then also make sure that these behaviors or issues actually do get addressed and not just, let it go or they're tolerated because of who their manager is or who they are in a company. Culture isn't what's written on the wall. It's what happens when those values are tested. So before we wrap up, I want to try something new in this podcast, and I'll probably be adding it into every podcast from here on out if it makes sense. But one of the things I started doing is intentionally seeking out stories from HR professionals, from leaders, from employees, friends about real workplace experiences. Some of them are messy, some of them are so validating, and all of them are anonymous. But this is our story time segment that I'm adding to the podcast. I'm going to start with my own, and then we will jump into some anonymous red flags to kind of end out this episode. I thought that would be fun. So let's kick it off. I will start with a personal story for me, and I'm going to leave out all personal information, of course, for that company's privacy. But I once worked for a company that failed to provide W-2s on time for their employees. And before anyone jumps to conclusions, no, this wasn't an HR decision. It was completely out of my control, but that didn't matter. From the employee's perspective, HR is the face of things like payroll, taxes, compliance. So when those W-2s weren't readily available come the deadline, that trust was gone. And once trust is broken, it's really hard to rebuild. Employees stopped believing in me, even when I was advocating for them behind the scenes, even when I was doing everything I possibly could. And then I realized something really uncomfortable. This wasn't a fixable situation. The lack of accountability, the way leadership handled it, the absence of transparency, the expectation that HR would just smooth it over without any real support, that's what made it toxic. And that was one time in my career where I genuinely felt like I felt as an HR professional. Not because I didn't care, but because the system I was in made it impossible to do right by my team. And I eventually had to leave that role, not because I didn't want to fight for my employees, but because staying would have meant that I was accepting the situation that couldn't be fixed. And that's an important thing to say out loud. Not every toxic workplace can be repaired, and choosing to leave doesn't mean you failed. So instead of doing story times for this first segment of the podcast, I'm going to start off with just doing some red flags that have been posted anonymously on Reddit. And these are some of the biggest red flags that I keep seeing over and over. And it's things like being constantly short-staffed, companies that are proudly saying we're a family, like we talked about earlier, really high turnover, rules that seem to change depending on who's in charge that day. When there's a lot of gossip and snitching culture, not fun. People getting hired on the spot with no real process, that can definitely be a red flag. When you have company dinners or potlucks happening off the clock, yeah, it makes sense. And then PTO for mental health days getting declined came up a lot as well, which I think is pretty crazy, but that's a really big red flag, I would say, as well. And honestly, I could keep going. There was so many good just red flags that people were posting about their experience. And so, like I said, moving forward, I'll be sharing more anonymous stories like the one that I shared from myself, from, HR professionals and leaders who have been in the middle of situations that tested their values, their limits, and sometimes their careers. So if you're an HR professional and this episode resonated with a previous workplace or even your current workplace, hopefully this episode helped you get ready to build a plan to help get your workplace culture back on track. Or at least gave you some tips to be ready to spot toxic workplace red flags early before it gets too bad. So thanks for hanging out with me today and tuning into this week's episode of Coffee and Compliance. Next week, we're going to be talking about how to know if HR is the right career for you. I think that'll be a lot of fun. So new episodes are posted every Monday at 8 a.m. Central. And until next time, keep your coffee warm and your workplace compliant.